Hello and welcome to Learning Python number 5. This lesson is going to be about functions. And functions are a bit different from everything else that we've gone over so far. And it's probably a lot easier to look at actual code that implements functions than to talk about them. So we're only going to briefly go over what they are. So first of all, if you know other programming languages, and especially object-oriented programming languages, then you know about methods and classes and how methods are tied down to classes. Um, but you don't need to know any of that because in Python, at least for functions, functions are completely independent of anything else, and they're basically just things that you write in your code that are going to perform some actions when you call them, or like when you refer to them later on in your program. So the syntax of a function looks a little similar, a little different than a lot of the other things that we've done. So you start off by saying def, which is just like we're saying we're defining some function, and then whatever function name we want, and then two parentheses, and then however whatever our argument list is. We'll talk about what an argument list is shortly, and then as always a colon at the end of it. And then the first line, if you have one, is going to be your documentation string. So a documentation string is somewhat optional, but it's highly recommended. Generally, you're going to use three double quotes in order to write it. And if you do three double quotes, then that means that you can put it on however many lines that you want, as long as it starts with three double quotes and ends with three double quotes. But basically, it's just going to give a brief description of what a function does. And then the function is going to perform whatever actions you tell it to perform. And then the last statement, which is going to basically end the function, is somewhat optional. You can have it return something. So again, double quotes for the documentation string gives a brief description of what it is. And then in terms of an argument list, so basically an argument list is some list of variables that we need in order to perform the function. We might not even need any variables, but it's generally good practice to understand what it is anyway, because a lot of times you are going to want to accept variables when you're calling a method, or a function rather, sorry. They are different. So if the arguments are not defined, then you have to pass them values when calling the function. So basically you have the option when you're creating the function to give it sort of like a default value. So here you see that we're assigning whatever argument one to some value. And you don't have to assign it to a value, but if you do, then that value will serve as the default value. And we'll look at some examples of that shortly. And then lastly, basically what returning a value means is that you're going to store something in another variable or print it to an output. So basically at the end of a function, you can return something, meaning this function will output it. So wherever you're calling it, it will then output it there. So you can either store it in another variable or you could print it just directly. And then when you're calling a function, what you're going to look to do is write the function name and then some parentheses and then the argument lists. And you're going to have to call it below wherever you've defined it in your specific module. Obviously, because you need to know what it does before you can call it. So defining it comes first. And then when you're calling a function that returns something, you're probably going to either want to print it, so print function name argument list, so basically the same thing except you're doing it in a print statement, or you could store that in a different variable. So let's say that some function is going to return the value 4. We can store that value 4 in some variable called like number or something. And then lastly, for documentation strings, which are these things that tell us a brief description of what it is, there are a few ways of accessing it. You can either print it directly by saying print and then help, and then whatever the function name is. You don't have to put an argument list. You just use the function name. Or you could store the documentation string in a different variable. So you would do function name dot underscore underscore doc underscore underscore. So this is accessing the documentation string of whatever function this is, and then storing it in a variable, and then you could print that variable if you wanted to. Okay, so that was a lot of information, so let's try to break it down by looking at some specific programs. So this here is going to have two functions that we can see, one called print value and one called square. So let's look at print value first. We see that it's defining print value, and it has 2 arguments. Arguments are always separated by a comma. So we have value, comma, so this is 1 argument. Value 2 gets 2. So we see that this has a default value of 2, whereas value does not have a default value. So that means that we, at the very least, when we're calling it, have to give it something to give into value. And then the documentation string is this is going to print values we give it. Great. Okay, and then we can see that what it does is just going to print stuff, and there is no return statement, so we don't have to worry about that. So let's try to use this and call it. So let's call print value, and then let's try to only give it, actually no, first let's give it absolutely nothing and see why that doesn't work. Let's run it, and we see traceback error, type error, missing 1 required positional argument value. So that's telling us that the program itself knows that we need to at least define value, because value 2 is defined but value 1 is not, but we didn't do that. So we have a few options in doing that. We can write value gets 1, and we can see that that's going to work now. So your value is 1, and then your second value is 2 because it defaulted to 2. Or since value is the first variable in your argument list, you can simply write 1, and then it'll figure out that that's exactly what you mean. And then you can even change value 2 by simply writing in another value here, because the arguments are inputted in the order of your argument list. So value 1 should be 1, and value 2 is now being overridden. It's no longer 2, it's now 4. So let's make sure that works. Here you can see it's 1 and 4. Perfect. And then you can get even a little weird with this, and you can say, actually, I want to write value 2 first, in which case you would have to assign it specifically like this. So now we should see that it flip-flops over here, and now it's 4 and 1. So those are just the different ways that you can assign values. This function also works with strings, so we can write works with strings, and we can see that this will also work. And that's basically to say that just because you're assigning a value here doesn't mean that it has to be a value. It doesn't have to be of the same data type. So even with value 2, we're saying that it's defaulting to 2, which is an integer data type, but this also works with strings. Also strings. And we can just see that that works really quickly. And yes, also strings. So even though we said it started with 2, that's part of the beauty of Python in the fact that it doesn't have a specific data type. It can just switch really, really easily. Okay, so now let's look at a function that returns a value, which we have here in the form of the function square. So we're saying we're defining square, and we're giving it 1 argument with a default value of 4 called num. So this function calculates the square of a number, and as we know, the square of a number is whatever it is times itself, so num times num is stored in result, and then we are returning result. So notice our return is orange because it's a keyword. Okay, so we can get rid of this now because we only want to work with square, and again, make sure that anytime you're calling a function, it's below the function. So how do we call something that returns something? Well, we can simply print it. So let's just try the very basic print square. And notice how num is already assigned, and there's no other positional argument in which we have to assign anything to, which means this should work just fine. And we can see that it prints the square of 4, which is 16. Now what happens if we want to give it a value? Well, let's just give it a value. Printing the square of 19, which is 361, which is correct. It's basically just returning it by giving this output. So when we're calling square, you can essentially think of it like this. When you call square, it's going to return something, meaning that whatever you write here becomes the output. So we're outputting 361 in this case, and so we're printing 361. Now what happens if we want to store that in a value? So let's say store value. We're going to store whatever the call is here into store value. So whatever this returns gets stuck in store value, and then we can print store value just to see what it has within it. and we can see that store value contains 361. So those are the two options when working with things that you're returning. Again, a good way to think of it is this doesn't actually say square 19. This says whatever is in the return statement. So this says result, which we see is the result, which is 19 times 19, otherwise known as 361. Okay, so now let's look at a bit of a more complicated module here. So this might be a little overwhelming at first, but a lot of the red lines are simply just comments. Actually, they're all comments telling us what we have. So again, we've already talked about this, but functions are generally defined first in a module. So this here is our list of functions, and we're going to be looking at them individually. This one should look familiar. We're saying that we're printing a value, and this is going to print whatever value we give it, except this time we're only doing one value to make it a little more simple. And then we're going to have change value. And then we also have square range, and convert to Fahrenheit. So let's start down here with what we have for calling the functions. So in order to give value some sort of value, we're going to assign number gets 10 and then print a value of number. And since we're printing the value of some number, we're saying that this value gets number, and we know that number has 10. So therefore value has 10. And so we can also see down here that we're going to do the exact same thing, except we're going to say that strings work too. So let's just run this program, and a lot of things come up, but we're only going to focus on the first thing. So your value is 10, and your value is strings work too. And so that is basically just going to be what output we expected. And since we've already looked at that, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. However, this next one reads, this should change the number to 1, but that only works because it refers to it as a global variable. So first of all, what is a global variable? Well, let's check out this right here. So global variables have to do with the scope of a variable. So in most instances that we've talked about so far, variables have the scope of a module. And a scope basically means somewhat of its lifespan. So if it has a modular lifespan, also known as a global lifespan or scope, it can be called any time in the entire module. The alternative to that would be a local lifespan or a scope. A local scope would be something like value. So like we could try to print value, but printing value wouldn't do anything. Here we can try that here. So print value. So here we are assigning value to number. So you would think if we print the value, well, it should print whatever the number is, so 10. So it should print 10. But let's see what happens instead. Well, we get an error. It says that value is not defined. And the reason value is not defined is because this value is done. It's gone as soon as this method is, or this function is called. So this has a local scope or lifespan because as soon as this function is done being called, so as soon as print value is over, this variable is now gone. It's no longer a part of the program, and therefore you can't print it because it's not defined at all. So in order to print or use the global variable rather than a local variable in a function, you simply write the word global, and you'll see that it comes up in orange to remind you that it's a keyword and that you can now refer to a global variable. So we are talking about global number, and we can see that number is defined here, and since it's not in a function itself, this is not a global variable, and therefore, or it is a global variable, and therefore we can call it, we can change it. So we know that number is 10, but we're actually going to change the value. So here we are going to change the value. So what does change value do? Well, it takes the number from the global variable number, and then it makes it 1. Okay, so what happens if we print that? Well, if we check out what it does, it says that our value is 1. And we can see that because we're printing value. And now here, what's interesting about this is that when you're printing a value, we know that you're printing whatever it's returning. And since change value does not return anything, notice how there's no return statement like this for this function. When you try to print something, that doesn't return anything, it simply writes none. So that kind of tells you that no, actually this didn't return anything, so it printed none. So just to check that number was in fact changed to 1, we instead called print value, and then it said our value is 1. And that is great. So now let's move on to the next set of calls. So since square doesn't print anything, we can print what it returns. So this is the opposite. So notice how we try to print this here and we got the output of none. Well, now we're doing what we did exactly before. We're trying to print square, and square does the exact same thing that we talked about in the previous module. And square simply prints the square of whatever we tell it. And since it defaulted to 4, it printed 16. Okay, so now moving on, we can also store what is returned in a different variable. So again, we already talked about this, but let's take another look. So now we're still using the same exact variable number, but it's fine because we're already done with this. This has already been changed. So now we can store something new in it, and we can store whatever this returns, square 13, which is 13 times 13, or 169. And we're going to print that value. And then here we see that number now contains 169, just as it should. And then one of the really useful parts of functions is that you can call them multiple times. So here we have a function square range, and let's check out what that does. So this will square each number in the range and print each result. So now we're using a for loop, which is one of the structures that we've previously talked about, in order to print the square of every, in order to print the square of every number in some range for whatever range we give it, lower to upper. So basically, from 1 to 7, print the squares of it. And we can see 1 to 49, it does that perfectly. And what you'll notice is that square range actually calls square right here. So this is a function calling another function. And we can do that because if you look here, square has been defined already, so square range knows exactly what to do. So therefore it's printing whatever output it gets from this. And we know that we can print it because this is returning it. So whatever result it gets from square of I, which is what you get from the for loop, it's going to print it. And we can see that that works. And then why functions can be really useful is that you can call them multiple times. So here we're calling square range 1 to 7, but we're also calling 13 to 17. So we have 1 to 49 and then 13 to 17 right here. And that allows you to do different sorts of functions with different sorts of inputs. So notice how none of these numbers are the same, but it uses the exact same function to do that, which is really cool. And now let's look at a function that can actually be considered useful in the real world. So this is going to convert some Celsius value to Fahrenheit. And we can read this will print the Celsius temperatures in increments of 10 from lower to upper and the Fahrenheit equivalents. Okay, so we'll see how that works out. And as we can see here, we have this documentation string, and notice how these are all in one line. Well, as we talked about before, it doesn't have to be that way. You can actually have documentation strings going all the way across multiple lines, so long as you use the triple double quote. Okay, so now we're not going to talk about why this works. You can look at it yourself. In fact, you should look at it yourself in order to understand that this is a for loop, and it's going to use the lower and upper range that we give it. And then we see convert to Fahrenheit 0 to 100, and since it's not returning anything, it's printing it itself, it simply prints it itself. And that's great. This is really cool because this is one of the first real world, actually probably useful things that we've done so far. And you can see how it's really not that hard. Realistically, it's only 4 or 5 lines of code. And then the last thing that we're going to do in this module is look at the documentation strings for convert to Fahrenheit. So we talked about 2 different ways that you can print them. Well, you can print help convert to Fahrenheit, which is the function name. And then let's see, what does that give us here? Well, that gives us this here. So this gives us this whole thing. And this gives us a lot more information than the alternative way of printing it does, but let's look at what it says. So help on function convert in module main. So this is basically an introduction telling us this is the documentation string. and then it gives us the name as well as the arguments, and then it gives us the documentation string formatted exactly like we had it here, and then it tells us what it returns. And as we said, it doesn't return anything, so it says none. However, a lot of the time you don't really need this much information. So the alternative would say we're using square range now, so that is this function right here, and we are going to simply store the documentation string in help string, and then we're going to print help string. Help string can be any variable, but for this instance we just called it help string because that's basically what it is. And it just says this function will square each number in the range and print each result, and that is quite literally only the documentation string. So this method gives you far less information than this method does. So basically it's just choose whichever method you want based off of what you're doing. Okay, so now let's take a look at this program here. So this is a program I wrote that sort of just showcases what you can do with functions. So this is a single function that's sort of a game, but we'll see what it does. So you have 4 guesses to guess the password. What likes bananas? I like bananas, so me. Try again. Okay, I guess that was wrong. It tells me now I have 3 guesses, so let's say monkey. Monkey likes bananas. That's right, okay. So I had 2 guesses left. And now we're moving on to the next one. So I have 5 guesses to the password. What do you use to type? I use my phone to type. No, I use my fingers to type. My hands? My forehead? No, my toes. Oh, I'm out of guesses. I guess I didn't get it. And then it's simply asking us again, except this time we only have 1 guess. But I guess we already know the answer, and it's monkey, and that's right. I had 0 guesses left. All right, so I guess that was a little wacky and sort of out there in terms of usefulness, but basically it's checking a password. And we gave it some sort of hint, which was what likes bananas or what to use to type, and some number of guesses. And I guess we had whatever the actual answer was. And so if you think about it, those are probably the arguments in some sort of function. And if we check here, we see that we're defining password check, which is the name of the function, as number of tries gets 4, hint gets what likes bananas, and then the password is monkey. So we could say that the default is exactly what we had here. And so if we had to guess, we would say that they simply called the method and didn't pass it any new arguments. And you can see here that that is in fact the case. I'm not going to run through exactly how this all works, but again, I encourage you to figure out for yourself why it works and how it works. I will tell you that a lot of the bulk of the code comes from changing guess to guesses for the plural. Notice how this says 2 guesses, this says 1 guess, and then this says 0 guesses again. If you were okay with saying you have 1 guesses left, then the code becomes a lot simpler, but that's besides the point. So now we can see that we were able to change the number of tries very easily, which said number of tries gets 5, the hint gets what do you use to type, and the password is keyboard. And then you don't have to change all of the defaults, which we can show here, where we're just changing number of tries to 1. So since these are all defined for us already, they have like their preset or default answers, we don't actually have to do anything with them because they're already there. And so by giving it number of tries gets 1, it uses number of tries as 1, and then it gives us whatever the defaults were. So that's sort of a fun example of what you can do with functions. So let's look at some things that you should try to do after viewing this lesson. So a few ideas for what you can do is to create a function that accepts some number of feet and convert it to meters. So that's a pretty simple function to do, but it will help you understand how things work. So let's say that instead of printing the answer, you wanted to return the answer. So that should show you I can input this certain number of feet, and then it will output this number in meters, and you can try to both print that output as well as return the output and then print it through a variable. And then alternatively, you can create a function that accepts a number and prints all of the factors of that number. So we talked about how to use modulus in the previous lesson. That could be really good for that example. And then I think that the absolutely most important thing that you can do is to create a program yourself, whatever you want it to do. So I decided that I wanted to make password check, which is basically sort of like a game almost, and I just had fun with it. Um, I only used one function, but you can certainly use more. And if you can use at least three functions that interact with each other, perhaps even. So remember how square implemented square range, or sorry, square range implemented square. It can be really useful to see how things work together, and you can actually use different functions together as well. And lastly, creativity is so important in programming. If you don't have any sorts of creativity and you just sort of do whatever I tell you to do, then you're not really learning. You're just sort of regurgitating what I do. And I think that it's really important to understand what you're doing as well as have fun with it. So that's just like the best of both worlds. You're understanding it better and having fun with it. So have fun, make some games, post in the comments, whatever you want. But yeah, that's about it for now. Again, we talked about functions, we talked about global and local variables, although there wasn't a slide on it, and we talked about documentation strings, and we talked about a lot in this lesson. So I would highly recommend taking the time to do these practice exercises, as well as especially creating your own function. So that's about it for this lesson, and I will see you later.